Scripture reading tonight is Joshua chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. Joshua chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. This is out of the ESV. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes, and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Please be seated.
Good evening. If you did not get a handout and you would like one, could you go ahead and raise your hand, please? I'd like for you to take a few minutes with me and to imagine life as a young teenager in the land of Egypt, life as a young Israelite in the land of Egypt. I want you to think about all the stories you would hear of how your family and your nation came to the land of Egypt, of the stories you would hear of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, maybe one of the brothers that Jacob, or one of the sons that Jacob had, maybe even stories of times before slavery. But then I want you to think about what it would put yourself in that situation. You would then hear rumors of two men who traveled to see the Pharaoh, the king of all Egypt, and went before the Pharaoh and demanded that your people be released from slavery, and that if not, terrible plagues would hit the land. And then you hear the rumors of the Pharaoh refusing to let your people go. And then the plagues begin. You see the horror of the land destroyed by locusts and frogs, gnats, flies, and hail. You see the water turned into blood. You see and feel the presence of the darkness over the land. You see the livestock of the Egyptians dead. And then you hear a rumor of what would happen as the last plague. That the firstborn of every Egyptian, whether it's livestock or people, will be killed if they do not follow the instructions that God has laid out. And so you are there, and then you follow the instructions that God laid out to your people, and you hear the next morning that the firstborn of all things, from the livestock up to the son, the firstborn son of Pharaoh, is dead. And Pharaoh and the people of Egypt, their morale is broken, and so Pharaoh lets your people go. And so you and your family pack up, and you gather all your possessions, all your livestock, and you take some of the Egyptians' livestock and possessions, and you leave with the rest of your nation. And you begin your journey into the wilderness, and by day you're following this cloud, and by night you're following this pillar of fire. And you and your people journey to the edge of the Red Sea. And you suddenly hear a rumor that the Pharaoh of Egypt and his entire army are headed to you to kill most of you and then take the rest of you as slaves. But suddenly you see the Red Sea part, and you watch as your people begin to walk on dry ground and walk across together. And when all of your people make it across, you see the Egyptian army, all their chariots, begin to start into the Red Sea, start onto the dry ground. And as Pharaoh's army gets into the sea, the waves crash over them, and you don't see them anymore. And then your people continue their journey of the Exodus. You continue through the wilderness, and about 2 months into this journey, you begin to run out of food and water. And your people begin to cry out to Moses, and they say, "Did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Did you just bring us out of slavery just so we could die in the wilderness?" And you hear that Moses and God talk, and God tells Moses that in the mornings there will be bread from heaven on the ground. And so the next morning, after Moses has gathered up the leaders of each tribe and has told them what they are to do with the bread from heaven, there's this white flaky stuff covering the ground like the morning dew. And you look outside and you see it on the ground, and everybody has the same reaction. What is it? And so your people call it what it literally is, manna, which means, what is it? And for the next 40 years, your people eat manna in the morning and quail in the evening, and you save it and do as God tells you to do with it. But for 40 years, you eat manna. And then your parents die, and Moses and Aaron die, and God raises up a new leader for your people. That leader is Joshua, and Joshua talks to God, and God tells him to go into the promised land. And so you and your people cross the Jordan and set up memorial stones to teach the younger generations of the things that have happened in the wilderness and what's about to happen. And after all this, you celebrate the Passover, and you begin to eat the produce of the land. And then one morning, the morning right after that, you wake up, and there's no manna on the ground. What do you do when the manna ceases? How do you react? For 40 years, your people have eaten off of the thing that God provided for you from the ground, off of the little flaky white stuff on the ground that you call, what is it? How do you react to that being gone? That was your main source of food, and you're about to go fight all of the people who are in this land that God told you you're about to take. And you have this source of food that has disappeared. What do you do when the manna ceases? In life, there are big changes all the time. I don't think that's a shocking idea to anyone. When those changes happen, we need to recognize and remember that God provides. It must have been absolutely mind-blowing for some of the Israelites who had lived their entire lives. They had just come into the land, and they lived their entire lives only knowing of manna and quail being provided for them. And suddenly they wake up one morning, and it's not there. But what I want us to understand is that through this life-changing event, God still provided. God was still providing, and God was going to keep providing. And so tonight I want us to look at how we should react when the manna ceases in our life. So first, when the manna ceases, look back on what God has provided for you. When the manna ceases, look back on what God has provided for you. On the day the manna ceased, I really wonder how did the people react? Did they look around and think, "Oh, this is not good"? Were they fearful? Did they panic? Did they think something had gone wrong? I wonder if it was excitement because they had just eaten of the produce of the land. Did they think, "Oh, good, we have some new fruits and vegetables and other things to eat now"? The ceasing of the manna was a drastic change in their life that was, like I said, a complete shift in their whole lifestyle. And in our lives, we're going to experience some things like that. And so when that happens, we need to be sure that we look back on what God has already provided for us. It can be easy when these big, monumental things happen in life. And so looking back when times change, looking back on the blessings that God originally blessed us is a good way to remember that. I like to think of something like a car. It's a big blessing to have a car, to drive around, to get places very quickly, or moderately quickly. It was kind of interesting. As I was preparing for this lesson this last week, I ended up having car trouble, and I had to take what I'm telling you and apply it to my life, say, I got to think back to the blessing of just having this car in the first place. It's a pain to deal with car trouble. It's frustrating and it's inconvenient, but it's a blessing to have the car in the first place. And looking back and realizing it's a blessing to have that just makes it easier to handle and easier to think, well, God, thank you for this blessing, and remembering that God provided that blessing for us in the first place. Out of the 3 points tonight, this one may be the easiest because we have the capacity to look back. We have the ability, which in itself is also a blessing, to look back on the things that God has already blessed us with. Though it's the easiest, that doesn't mean it's easy, though. And so I want us to go ahead and look at one example of someone who understood what it means to look back on the blessings God had provided them with. If you go ahead and turn to Job chapter 1, we'll read something from there in a second. But Job lost everything. He lost his 10 children, he lost all of his livestock, and he lost all of his servants within, as he's told, within a matter of minutes. And when this major change in his life occurs, we find something interesting. So if you look at Job chapter 1 and verses 20 through 22, it says, Then Job arose after he'd lost everything, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped. And he said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. When the manna ceased in Job's life, he understood that he needed to look back on the blessings that God had provided him with. I hope that none of us ever go through the things that Job experienced in his life, but I hope that we have the same attitude and reaction as Job did. When the manna ceased in his life, he was able to look back on what God had provided for him. When big changes happen, when the manna ceases in our life, we need to look back on what God has provided. Next, when the manna ceases, look around on what God is providing. Look around at what God is providing. On the day the manna ceased, I wonder if the Israelites went outside and they saw there was no manna on the ground, and they start looking around, thinking, did my neighbor take my manna, or am I just outside too early? What's going on? I wonder if they thought maybe like an animal came and ate it. But again, though the blessing of the manna had stopped, there were still blessings all around them that God had provided for them. And so when the manna ceases, we need to look around at what God has provided and is providing. Again, it can be easy to forget about the blessings that we have in the present time when these changes, these big changes or trying times in our life come about. I like to think of it as our ability to store food in a refrigerator. So I have a really it's well functioning, and it's a large refrigerator and freezer back at my apartment in Denver. And yet every night, I think that an In-N-Out cheeseburger sounds way better than whatever's in that fridge right there. And then my brain tells me it's only 13 minutes away. That's not too bad. And so I'm ignoring the blessing of having this food stored in my apartment right at my fingertips that doesn't take that long to make. And I'm looking for other things. And so we need to, I ought to look at the blessings that are right in front of me. And I think one great example of that we see in the Apostle Paul. If you want to go ahead and turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, or I'm sorry, Philippians chapter 4. Paul endured a lot for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the church, the early church. He did much work for the church and the gospel, and we have him to thank for most of the writings of the New Testament. But Paul, like I said, endured much, and he had the right attitude. If we are just looking through some of the writings of Paul, we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that he talks about all these things that he has endured for the sake of the gospel. And then if we go into Philippians chapter 4 and verse 10 through 13, we read about Paul's attitude through all these trials. So let's go ahead and read Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13 together. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul was able to write these things from house arrest in Rome because he understood that he needed to look around at the blessings that were right in front of him. It was not his ideal situation to be arrested and not traveling around and sharing the gospel, but he understood that it was still a blessing to be where he was and writing these letters. He understood that it was God who was still providing for him, though he wasn't in the situation he wanted to be in. And so when the manna ceased in Paul's life, he understood to look around at what God was providing for him. So when the manna ceases, don't forget to look around at the blessings around you. And lastly, when the manna ceases, look ahead at what God will provide. Look ahead at what God will provide. On the day that the manna ceased, I wonder if the Israelites realized that they had just entered the promised land. If they remembered the last words of Moses as he encouraged them and as he encouraged them to take the promised land. I wonder if they thought about all the promises that had been made to their forefathers. I wonder if they looked at the land and thought, this will be our land. I wonder if they had the faith to do that. And though the manna ceased that day, though that blessing ceased, there were still many blessings to come. There were still many things that God was going to provide for them. Out of the 3 points, this one may be the most difficult, because when life gets hard, it's easy to look back on the good times, and it's hard to see what's just around the corner, what's ahead for us. As I was saying, the Israelites had so much to look forward to. They had the promised land, and they definitely go through ups and downs as a people through the time of Joshua and the judges of Israel. But those downs were often caused because of the failure to look ahead at what God was going to provide for them. And to help us with understanding how God will help us, how God is still going to provide, I want us to go ahead and look at probably the best example we could look at in Jesus. If you would, go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, we have just concluded one of the greatest chapters in all the Bible that we sometimes call the Hall of Faith. It's one of my favorite chapters in all the Bible. And the writer has just laid out all these men and women of faith who have accomplished great deeds through faith. And then he begins talking about Jesus. And I want us to notice something pretty cool in this passage. So let's go ahead and read Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2 together. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings to us so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Notice how Jesus endured the cross by focusing on the joy that was set before him. That joy of being back in heaven, being reunited with his Father, that joy of setting us free from sin, the joy of saving us with his blood and giving us that opportunity we have to be in heaven with him one day. Jesus understood that there was a promised land waiting for us and that he was giving us the keys to it. And when the manna ceased, Jesus knew to look ahead. So when the manna ceases, look ahead to see what God will provide, just like Jesus did. God provides. Even when the manna ceases, God is there providing. Life has a lot of twists and turns, and like I said earlier, that's not a shocking statement to us. But through all of the twists and the turns, God is still providing. God is always providing for his people, and he always will. So when the manna ceases, look back on what God has provided. When the manna ceases, look around at what God is providing. When the manna ceases, look ahead to what God will provide. Because no matter what change comes in life, we ought to recognize and remember that God provides. There's an interesting connection between manna being bread from heaven and Jesus being bread from heaven for us. If you look in John chapter 6, Jesus calls himself the bread of life and the bread from heaven. And there's some interesting connections. You know, Jesus is our sustainer, and the manna sustained those in the wilderness. Jesus is going to reign forever as that manna from heaven. And Jesus helps us on our journey through this wilderness, just as the manna helped them on their journey through their wilderness. Like I said, God provided for his people then, and he's still providing for us now. God provided and prepared a way for Jesus. God is providing the message and method of salvation for us today, and God is going to provide for us an eternal home, a promised land. Though the manna ceases, physically, spiritually, God provides. Tonight, if you have any needs, if there's big change in your life and you need the prayers of the church, if you need to come to Jesus to find the bread of life, to find that bread from heaven, you can do that. We can pray for you, we can be here for you, we can study with you. But please come as we stand, as we sing together.